All right, I want to read an excerpt from my novel Gilgamesh Redux, which I published back in April of 2017, and I haven't read back over it since then. I usually just publish stuff and then move on and never go back unless there's a reason to. But a friend recently brought it up. He was interested in it, and I thought, and I sent him, he ordered the PDF, which, by the way, you can obtain from me for $20 directly at johndavidebert@gmail.com. If this interests you, I'm going to read the prologue to Gilgamesh. Now, one of the things that I did was, that's not usually done in a retelling of the Gilgamesh story, is to include the matter of Uruk. It actually comes out of a cycle of stories pertaining to the city of Uruk that involve Gilgamesh's father, Lugalbanda, and then Lugalbanda's father, Enmerkar, who is the man who invents writing, and then his father, Meskalamdug. So I actually incorporate their stories within this as kind of a prologue. And it's very difficult to find a satisfactory retelling of the Gilgamesh epic. There's almost something wrong with every single one of them. If you're reading a literal transcription, then it's very bumpy because there's lots of pieces missing from the clay tablets where words should be. So it's a bumpy experience, like Andrew George's version of it. It's good, but it's bumpy for that reason. So I don't like the bumps. And the smooth retellings that I've looked at have not been very good. Just trying to retell it as a story. So I thought I would retell it and give it a kind of stylization of the language. And, okay, so here it is. So it's kind of prose poetry is the way that it's written. And so here's the table of contents. I'm going to read the prologue, which will include an invocation to the sun god, a note on the great-grandfather, Meskalamdug, and then the tale of Enmerkar, the grandfather, and the tale of Lugalbanda, Gilgamesh's father. So I'll go ahead and read those. Invocation to the sun god. In those far-off days when the earth was still soft and pliant, it was you, Shamash, who carved your way out from beneath Ershetu and split the Mashu mountains in half. They ruptured in two pieces, volcanic magma pouring forth from them in red-orange glowing burning liquid streams. From the fissure out of which you emerged, a gigantic being carrying a saw in one hand and wearing a headdress of bull's horns as you shoved your way up out of the mountain and stepped forth to rumble the ground and walked a god, a giant, as you strode across the soft skin of the earth, your eyes unbearable to look at as you glowed, the sun god incarnate and father of Meskalamdug, who was father of Enmerkar, who was father of Lugalbanda, who was in turn father of Gilgamesh. May you glow forever, great one. All right, so I made that up, but it is an invocation. Epics should begin with some sort of invocation to the gods. And then a brief note on Meskalamdug. Around the year 2800 BC, King Meskalamdug founded the first dynasty of Ur as a rival dynasty to that of Kish. He was the contemporary of Etana, the king of Kish, who flew to the celestial domain of the goddess Inanna on the back of an eagle. The Sumerian king list says that Meskalamdug was the son of the sun god Utu, Babylonian Shamash, and that he founded the dynasty and ruled for 324 years. More mysteriously, it also says that he entered the sea and disappeared, or else ascended the mountain, possibly an epithet for death. Mythologically, it could mean that he disappeared into the sea like the setting sun, or on the literal level, it may refer to an expedition down the Persian Gulf to Oman, i.e. ancient Magan, in order to acquire the much-needed copper to create weapons for his dynasty, while an ascent to the mountain may refer to a journey to the Zagros Mountains to obtain tin necessary for the production of bronze weapons. The city of Uruk, known nowadays as Unug, with its two temple complexes, Kulab, sacred to the high god An, and Iana, sacred to Inanna, probably amounted to little more than a kind of Carolingian fortified castle, receiving influences from the cosmopolitan cities of Kish and Nippur to the north. In any event, he is the father of Enmerkar, the second king of the dynasty. And so now I retell the tale of Enmerkar, and also the birth of Uruk, Gilgamesh's grandfather, who invents writing as he sends a messenger back and forth between the city of Uruk and the city of Arata, trying to bring Arata to the yoke, and also to set up international trade. But also it's the birth of the Sumerian language, the written language. In those days, there were no walls around the city, only baked brick cube houses raised on an earthen mound with flat-topped roofs clustered so densely together that the narrow streets appeared to have been tunneled out by some enormous larval creature that made its living chewing on mud bricks. The Eanna temple was still a primordial skeleton of bricks, slogs, and ragged unfinished walls, a kind of castle with fortifications, and the great pillars of the courtyard had not yet acquired their epidermic stone cone mosaic. International trade did not yet exist, and there was no writing. The northern city of Kebnuna had not yet been built, and too many tongues scattered forth scintillae of light dispersed throughout all the cities over all the lands in which the gods dwelled. The reticulations of irrigation had only recently been invented by the god Ninurta, who killed the Asaku demon and transformed his army of stone soldiers into the first canals, cloven to draw the mud-brown waters through massive arterial veins that pulsed through the cities and made them bulbous with human swarms. These were the days in which Enmerkar, son of Meskalamdug and grandfather of Gilgamesh, was the second king of Uruk. 2. One day as he was bringing offerings of goats and milk to the shrine of Inanna, he asked her to allow the city of Arata to build the holy mountain of the Ayanna for her as a residence within which to reside, and he begged her to allow Arata to cut precious stones, lapis lazuli, and gold and silver and tin and copper, to bring them down out of the mountains, to build her a temple worthy of her name and majesty as mistress of the great above. And he heard her voice tell him that it would be done, and when he asked her how, she bade him summon forth his finest messenger to send up into the mountains, for there was a famine in the city, and Arata was in need of grain. So the city of Arata needs grain, and the city of Uruk needs metals for building its temples. The messenger was summoned, and Enmerkar told him the wishes of Inanna, and sent him forth across the 7 mountains to deliver his message to the lord of Arata. The city had been carved into the side of a mountain, smooth pink limestone angles bulging from geological serrations, stacked out of archaic strata formed at the birth of the world. The messenger had some climbing to do, and was exhausted by the time of his arrival in the palace chambers of the king of Arata. "What is it to me how your king spoke?" he said, and the messenger gave to him Enmerkar's words exactly as he remembered them, saying that lest he make the people flee from Arata and transform it into a city of the dead populated by skeletons, then Arata must pack bales of gold and tin and silver and lapis lazuli onto the backs of pack asses and send them down the mountain to the planar surface flatland world of Uruk, so that the temple for Inanna could be built properly. And the messenger also told him of the spell of Nudimud, which Enmerkar had bade him relate, to the effect that when the day came in which the world was rid of scorpions and wolves and panthers, and it was at peace, there would only be one language spoken, the language of Sumerian, and it would be the only language that anyone ever spoke. At this, the king of Arata laughed, and said that Arata would not submit to the yoke of Uruk, for Inanna had appointed it as doorpost to block the entrance to the highlands, and the city belonged to her, and Inanna would favor it over Uruk. The messenger, however, replied that it was his lord Enmerkar who had had Inanna installed as queen of the Ayanna and the Japar in Uruk, and at this the lord of Arata darkened, and his brow furrowed. He paced across the stone floor a moment, hands clasped behind his back, and then the lord of Arata had an idea, and he told the messenger that though his king might be eager for combat, he had another kind of contest in mind, and that only he who understood the nature of this contest could prevail, and that if Enmerkar accepted the challenge, then this is what he must do. He must not pour grain into bags or carts, but he must pour it into nets, and then load these nets onto pack asses, and if he were able to unload this grain successfully in the courtyard of Arata, without leaking it all out along the way, only then would the lord of Arata kneel before Enmerkar. The king insisted that the messenger repeat the message back to him word for word to make certain that it was correct, and then sent him on his way. 3. So back to Uruk now. When he had returned to Uruk and stood before Enmerkar in the soft, oily, rose-colored torchlight of his palace chambers, the messenger repeated word for word the challenge which the king of Arata had proposed, and Enmerkar grew pensive, and wondered aloud if the king of Arata really understood the true nature of this proposal. The king went to his storehouse, the grain storage of the goddess Nisaba, where he separated the old grain from new grain, and soaked green malt barley that sprouted so that it made the meshes of the nets smaller, and then he loaded these nets with grain, and put them onto pack asses, and sent them over the 7 mountains to the courtyard of Arata, where the grain was unloaded into huge piles, and the people who were starving from the famine marveled at the food, and they encouraged the king of Arata to submit to the yoke of Uruk. The messenger had accompanied them, and he sought audience once again with the lord of Arata, who asked him, "What is it to me how your king spoke?" And the messenger said that he had been instructed to offer a counter-challenge to the lord of Arata. For Enmerkar had given him a branch of the sacred mesh tree of Uruk, and the lord of Arata, if he was willing to acknowledge the overlordship of Enmerkar, should cut a piece of wood from this branch, and make a copy of Enmerkar's scepter, and send it back to him with the messenger. So note that the suffix of Gilgamesh's name is mesh, and it's named after the meshu tree, which is a sacred tree. So he has to come up with a way of making this scepter that's not made out of any known wood. And what he does come up with is a sort of plastic, like the world's first plastic scepter. The king of Arata was now furious, and he refused to eat. And the palace courtiers could hear him raving lunatic words from his bedchamber. And when the smoke-colored light of dawn crept between the lattices of his windows and his slaves went in to attend to him, They found him lying on the stone floor with cut marks all over his arms and legs and a bloody dagger lying nearby him, and he began speaking words of gibberish to them, and they were terrified and fled from his chamber as the stricken king stood up after them, shambling with a kilt striped by rivers of blood. Word began to drift through the city that their king had gone mad, and that Inanna had withdrawn her favor from him. But then something happened inside the king's mind, a dark region somewhere that glowed with a faint, luminous pulse, and he had Enmerkar's messenger summoned to his chambers once more, and told him that he had another challenge for the Lord of Uruk, namely that if Enmerkar could make a scepter that was not made of any known wood, neither cedar, cypress, palm, ash, poplar, rosewood, etc., and not made from any known metal or mineral, in short, if he could make a scepter that had never been made out of any known substance ever before, then he would accept the king's overlordship. The king made the messenger repeat the message back to him word for word to ensure that it was correct, and then sent him on his way back to Uruk. Now you'll notice that the messenger will be getting more and more tired, and what's going to happen is what McLuhan calls a reversal of the overheated medium of orality in this case, that reverses, it becomes overheated and no longer useful, and so writing has to be invented. 4. The messenger then raced over the 7 mountains to the still-forming city of Uruk. It lay unfolding its structures upon the black-green riverine landscape among the palms and the poplars like an embryo in a mother womb. Its ancient creaking shadufs and braying donkeys and darting lizards and linear rows of green fields striped with blue waterways composing the elements of its uterine environment. And before Enmerkar, the messenger repeated the king of Arata's second challenge to him word for word. And Enmerkar grew pensive once again, scratching his shaven chin and bald forehead, and pacing back and forth with his hands clasped behind his back. Then the god Enki alighted amongst the soft fibrils of his thoughts, and he summoned his craftsmen and instructed them to take a hairy hide and pound it with a pestle and dry it in the sun and treat it with certain oils so that a type of glue could be extracted from it, and that this glue should then be poured into the waxen mold for casting a scepter, and it would thus become the first scepter ever made out of such a strange, rubbery substance. 5. Enmerkar then dispatched his messenger across the 7 mountains once more, and soon he arrived at the palace chambers of the Lord of Arata and placed the strange scepter into his hands, and after carefully examining the scepter and handing it back, he flew into a rage and cried out to his officials, "Arata is now ruined, for holy Inanna looks with favor only upon Uruk. How long must we endure such a terrible yoke? This famine has made us into the slaves of Kulab." But the Lord of Arata had one final challenge to offer the Lord of Uruk, and Enmerkar's messenger was summoned to his chambers once again, that his king must produce a dog that was neither black nor white, brown nor red, yellow nor pied, and that this dog must engage in a wrestling contest with the king of Arata's dog, so that the stronger one should be known. The messenger yet again was sent racing back over the green hills and pink canyons and copper valleys to Uruk, and relayed the Lord of Arata's message to him, but Enmerkar immediately responded that he had a series of messages which the messenger must now carefully commit to his memory and recite before the Lord of Arata. The messenger, sweating, nodded. First, that Enmerkar would produce a cloth that was neither black nor white nor brown nor red, yellow nor pied, and wrap his dog within it, and then send the dog to wrestle with the Lord of Arata's dog. Secondly, Enmerkar told his messenger that he must tell the Lord of Arata to stop hesitating and come to a decision, for his people would follow him like sheep were he to make piles of lapis lazuli, gold, and silver in his courtyard. Third, he must explain to the king that unless he wanted his population sold into slavery and his mountain city to echo with the rattle of bones upon its stone floors, then he must build the shrines for the cities of Uruk, Eridu, and Inun, and load the necessary stones and metals and send them down the mountains on pack animals. But when the king required his messenger to repeat all that he had just told him, the messenger could not remember the words, for there were too many of them, and his mouth had grown heavy, and he stumbled upon them, and flushed with embarrassment. The Lord of Uruk grew pensive once again, and he stood up and paced back and forth with his hands clasped behind his back, and scratched his bald head, and waited until the god Enki alighted upon the soft fibrils of his thoughts once again, and he demanded of his attendants that some mud from the river bank be brought to him along with a piece of dried reed. When the clay was given him, he patted it down into the shape of a square with rounded corners, and then used the dried reed to inscribe his message upon it. He waited for the slab to dry, and then he handed it to the messenger, who took it but did not understand that Enmerkar had just invented writing, due to the failure of his exhausted memory to function properly. The messenger took the clay tablet and the textiles and headed off once again for the city of Arata, over the 7 mountains. 6. Across the ancient hills with their bones, the rocks, and up to the khaki-colored walls of the city of Arata, the exhausted messenger climbed, and found himself once again before the Lord of Arata, who demanded of him an answer to the challenge he had proposed to Enmerkar. The messenger handed him the clay tablet and explained to him that everything Enmerkar had told him could be found inscribed upon it. But the puzzled king held the tablet up near a brazier, and his brow darkened, for he had no idea what it was or what to make of it, and instead he turned and raised his eyebrows to look quizzically at the messenger. Enmerkar has just invented writing, of course, but nobody else can read it, since writing doesn't exist anywhere else other than Uruk, which is the point of the story. Uruk has supremacy culturally over all other cities at this time. At precisely that moment, however, the electric crackling of an enormous thunderclap sent by the storm god Ishkur resounded outside, and the gray metallic sky unleashed huge slabs of black viscous rain that lashed the earth with pink sunshot iridescent tails that muddied the ground and forced wet shrubs of thin green stalks of corn, chickpeas, barley, and wheat forth from the rocky parched soils. So we have the motif of the thunderclap, just like in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland or Joyce's Ulysses, and Eliot, by the way, took that from Ulysses, that announces the beginnings of the end of the wasteland and a greening. When his attendants informed him of this, the king of Arata was delighted that Inanna had not abandoned his city after all. He and the messenger stood at the edge of the city wall and gazed out over the vast gray distance where cloud shadows walked the earth and rain fell in luminous gold stripes over the cliffs and canyons in all visible directions. 7. Inside the shrine of Inanna, meanwhile, as Enmerkar was making offerings of goats and milk to the goddess, he heard her voice speak to him while he stood before her diorite statue, and she told him that from henceforth Uruk and Arata would engage in peaceful trade, and that Arata would load piles of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli into crates on pack animals, while Uruk would heap satchels and bags full of grain and textiles onto pack animals, and the two cities, both favored by the goddess, would exchange these animals, heaping up mounds of goods in the courtyards of their respective cities. And in that way, international trade came into being, and in that same way, Enmerkar invented writing, and Sumerian became the official international language, and the skeleton of the Eanna complex would be fleshed out and completed, so that the goddess could take up her proper residence within the city and live there. And all this took place under the reign of Ensi Enmerkar, son of Ensi Meskalamdug, and second ruler of Uruk, grandfather of Gilgamesh. All right, let's move on to the tale of Lugalbanda, who is the father of Gilgamesh. And this is a story you don't hear much about, and it's too bad because it's excellent. So I retell that here. Now, some years have passed, and Enmerkar is at war with Arata, and he is leading an army now that is composed. Lugalbanda is the youngest of 8 brothers. Years later, the army of Enmerkar on its way to Arata, after trade relations have broken down, a horizon splayed with sticks of bronze spears, heavy chariots, copper helmets, human swarm of living flies, ravaging the planar surface of the flat carnelian desert, coffee-brown fog of dust, sand, debris unleashed from a cleft in the earth that stains the lapis blue sky to erase the sun, a dim copper disk wan and pale in the vanilla air, eyes ripped out of their sockets, teeth made into mortars and pestles grinding sand, a dust rain that draws the onagers pulling the carts to a dead stop. A sickness ravaged Lugalbanda, the 8th son of Enmerkar, and he plunged to the sand a mud effigy as his 7 brothers surrounded him, raised him up and carried him upon their shoulders of pale Christ-walking mourners in a death dirge to the mouth of a nearby cave, an ancient Paleolithic mausoleum for the gods. Shamash, Ninhursag, and Inanna would not heed them, and he was laid out flat on his back, gone wasted and racked with fever and ruinous dread of the demon that the sandstorm had blown inside of him, some wayward creature with blue-fanned bat wings, thin, spindly legs, and a ruinous, gibbering, toothless mouth that had gotten into him and now had him turned upside down. A bird's nest of provisions, they made him: dates, figs, dried meat, cheeses, palm baskets of eggs and oil, chunks of animal fat, loaves of bread with date syrup, ingots of butter, leather skins of water, jugs of dark beer and white beer and red wine, sesame oil, aromatic oil. So this is the prototype of what later becomes the myth of Philoctetes, who is injured with a wound that smells so bad that the Greeks have to dump him off and leave him on an island. This is the prototype of that type of story. Ajax, the story of Ajax, is another variation of it. And they carefully placed his bronze axe near his head and tied his iron dagger. This is the way they would lay him out in a tomb, because they think he's going to die. And tied his iron dagger imported from the Black Mountains to his chest, while sweat leaked from him in profuse, oily patches that mixed with the dust from the storm to create a mud man who lay dying in the dark recesses of the cave. If the sun god restored him, he would arise from the cave an archaic Lazarus. But if it took him to Urkala, his body would remain stiffened and petrified for them to retrieve for proper burial on the way back from Arata. And with that mournful discussion, the brothers filed forth from the cave and emerged back out into the calcium-colored daylight beyond the cavern entrance to continue their journey to Arata. 2.5 days in the wasted darkness, and he lay begging for the sun god to drive the demon out of him. But he could only lie helpless, a broken rag doll, and wonder whether the darkness would claim him, and he would sink into it and feel himself dropping down into Urkala, losing his body and becoming a shade with feathers, and the thought drove terror into him, and he begged the sun god to restore him to health. On that night, the star of Inanna gleamed directly through the mouth of the cave, a burning vanilla stone, and he prayed to the mistress of harlots to rescue him, prayed to her to restore him to health, and the light of the mistress of the great above washed quietly over him, and the soft luminescence suffused the cavern with a nacreous glow of warmth from her light. Later the same night, the moonboat of Nanasine floated into view over the onyx sky and washed a soft effulgence into the cave, and he prayed to the god to heal him, restore him to his energies so that he could go find his brothers and fight with them at the battle of Arata. When, after 3 days, the sun god Shamash rose out of a crack in the earth and washed the cave clean with his gold-yellowed turquoise light, Lugalbanda awoke and felt that the demon had been driven forth from him, for his fever was gone, and he had an appetite and was able to eat some of the provisions left behind for him by his brothers. On that day, Lugalbanda rose from his cave and set out a lone stick figure, an elongated shadow of a man striding forth upon the flat desert, a thin shadow cast across its copper expanse in search of its body. He wandered the rusty hills until the trees erupted out of the dirt all around him, and rocks thrust their way up and formed skeletons of earth, and he began running as shadow no longer the shadow had found its maker, and attached itself to the pale, wan, wasted body that the gods had regenerated, and he could feel it growing now, becoming larger and fuller, as he ran that day until the sun gave way at the edge of the earth and splintered into pieces, and he found himself in a copse of trees in a forest clearing, and checked the leather satchel his brothers had given him. And inside of it he found 2 flint stones that he rubbed together to make fire, and smiled to see the flames light the leaves and kindling that he had prepared, and the glowing coals luminesced in the night sky, like some strange jellyfish lighting up the clearing. And he rolled some dough upon a flat stone, and cooked himself some bread, and ate it with date syrup, and slept in the all-consuming darkness, where the fiery amber stars walked over the lid of the sky while he slept. In the morning he spotted a lone black bull snuffling its way through the woods, and he set a trap for it, then stripped a branch from a juniper tree that was curled up like an old man, and he tied the snorting bull to the tree. And later in the day he caught 2 wasted leprous goats that could barely walk, and tied them both to trees, and that night he slept again beneath the burning stars of On, and Zangara, the god of dreams, came to him, surfacing with a kind of spongy liquidity out of the dream fabric, and bade him sacrifice the animals at dawn, and feed them to the gods. And when he awoke, the sky was still charcoal, and he grabbed his iron dagger and went over to the bull and stabbed it repeatedly over and over again, until it collapsed in a muddled, bloody heap as though it had been deflated. And then he cut the heads off the goats and carefully poured their blood into a hole he had dug into the earth. And as the sky swelled to a bloated purple color, he waited for the gods to come for their feast, and soon they came and fed greedily upon his offerings, as though they had never eaten such fine food before. But the portal through which they had entered into this world was left open behind them, and black, gibbering creatures with fangs and claws came through. Some of them had serpents for arms, and some had arms and legs that were like sticks, ending in sharp, snapping mouths with ragged teeth, and some were red with yellow eyes like coals that glowed in the dark, and some wiggled as they moved through the air, and others sailed on spiny wings and had no faces. And these creatures began to split apart, reproducing themselves as clones that spread through the air. And Lugalbanda stood looking up in the twilight from the forest floor, mouth open in amazement at such horrors. And the gods, Enki, Enlil, Ninursaga, Inanna, and Ninurta went to war against them, sending blazing currents of blue-white light that neutralized them and caused them to freeze up and disintegrate into a black, sooty ash that stained the air. And soon they were all gone, and the portal was closed, and the gods were gone too, and Lugalbanda lay upon the forest floor and fell asleep exhausted. 2. In the morning when he awoke, he didn't know where he was. He had somehow, during the battle above him the previous night, lost all sense of direction, but when he crested a nearby hill, he could see the swale of brownish-yellow landscape that swept out beyond him in all directions, and in the far distance there was an enormous hill with a tree upon it, larger than he had ever before seen in his life. And as he approached the tree, he could see that it was something so ancient, massive, and gnarled that it had been left over from a previous age, and he realized then that it must be the tree of the famed Anzu bird, which, as the dawn splashed its red streaks upon the lavender sky, he could see the enormous bird spread its wings that had claws, and he could see as it raised its triangular beak that it had razored teeth, like some incredibly huge Archaeopteryx, and he watched and waited for it to leave, soaring into the heavens, a huge black thing that soon disappeared over the edge of the earth. Lugalbanda made his way to the tree, and he climbed it all the way to the nest at the top that was woven of juniper and boxwood, and inside the nest was a single young hatchling. And Lugalbanda reached into his satchel and set out some sweetmeats for the creature, and dough laced with honey, and sprinkled it with cedar scent, and rouged its eyes with kohl. And then, when he was certain that the young bird had been taken care of, he descended the prehistoric tree and hid behind a limestone rock to await the return of its mother. When the creature returned, it was carrying a buffalo in its talons, and when it cried out to its youngling in the nest, there was no response, and it dropped the buffalo and hastened to the nest to find out why there had been no greeting to its mother. And it found that its hatchling had been cared for and provided with food and was well looked after, and the Anzu bird looked up, and Lugalbanda could hear it speak. And it said that whoever was responsible for caring for its young should show himself forth, and he would be rewarded by the Anzu bird and given the name, He Who is Made Great by Anzu. Lugalbanda stepped forth from behind his rock, a tiny figure dwarfed by a prehistoric tree and a monstrous bird, and admitted that he had been the one responsible for caring for the bird, and that he was willing to allow the Anzu bird to determine his fate. But when the bird offered him strength and weapons, Lugalbanda turned these things down, and instead asked only for the power to run faster than anyone on earth without ever tiring. And so the bird granted his wish, bestowed upon him this power, and they set forth, Lugalbanda speeding over the hill while the Anzu bird flew above and spied out the troops of his father's army, while Lugalbanda could see the dust they raised upon the horizon, and he thanked the bird, but the bird advised him to tell no one of his special powers, lest he arouse envy, and Lugalbanda agreed, as the bird disappeared into the sapphire heavens back to its nest. His brothers were amazed to see him, and they welcomed him, and could not understand how he had been resurrected, but Lugalbanda explained that he had been favored by the gods, and that they had restored him to health, and there was warm rejoicing and the drinking of beer and wine before the army once again set forth across the dusty pink plain, and marched until they found themselves within a league of the city of Arata. Before they had realized that the army had found itself trapped between the cliffs of a limestone canyon, and soon the sky was darkened with swarms of arrows that flew at them, and spears and javelins that fell upon them, and a constant rain that came down from the angled city carved into the side of the cliffs above. And this went on for month after month, until finally Enmerkar announced that someone would have to go back to Uruk to confer with Inanna and ask her why she had abandoned them, but no one volunteered for this task except Lugalbanda, at whom his brothers looked askance, but his father Enmerkar agreed to allow him to go, and Lugalbanda said that he would go on the condition that he go by himself and take with him only his weapons, and his father gave him his blessings. Lugalbanda sped back across the hills, pink canyons, rusty plains, and copper ravines, and he arrived at the city of Uruk that very night, and immediately made his way through its crowded streets to the Inanna temple complex, where the huge columns of Inanna's temple were covered with their stone cone mosaics, and he went past the bald and naked priests who were bringing in her offerings, and demanded that he be allowed to see her immediately, and the priests led him past, and he went in to find Inanna at rest upon her couch with her lion beside her, and she was surprised to see him, wondering at his lone return, and he gave to her his father's message, that Enmerkar, though he had built up the city on her behalf, was now at the mercy of Arata, and was under siege, and would perish unless Inanna did something to help them. The black-haired goddess grew pensive for a moment, and then she stood and told Lugalbanda that there were two things his father must do on her behalf in order for him to win the war against Arata. There was a lone tamarisk tree along the riverbank that Enmerkar must cut down, and then turn the wood into a special bucket for her, and then there was a certain type of rare fish, a gishesh fish, that he must find in the river, catch it in the bucket, prepare it, and serve it, and then he would receive the powers from her to defeat Arata, and Arata would be at his yoke once again, and trade relations would resume as they had years before. Lugalbanda sped back over the desert and through the uplands to deliver Inanna's message to his father, who was delighted to hear it. Arata was soon reticulated with lines of capture, and its riches, gold, silver, lapis lazuli, poured into the coffers of Uruk. Lugalbanda would become the third king of Uruk after the death of his father, and he would marry the cow goddess Lady Ninsun, and together they would raise a child they called Gilgamesh. And so those are the sort of prequels, let's say, and then we begin with Gilgamesh, but I tell one other story that's not normally included with Gilgamesh, and so I'll just conclude here by reading this short prologue about the story of Akka, when Gilgamesh is a boy king of only 17. The walls were not finished. A mud-brick skeleton surrounding the city, ragged, serrated gaps and saw-toothed edges of missing bricks and chips of teeth. The army of Akka had gathered on the dusty plain on the other side of the embankment beyond a line of bleached palm trees, dates, dangling spears, shields, copper helmets, sickle swords, daggers of bronze, and fields of humpbacked goatskin tents that looked made out of the dirt itself, as if it had grown a leathery crocodile hide to the far distant hinge where the dusty sky met the watery blue earth. Inside the city, box-like, pale tan, crumbling, sun-wrecked houses behind ramshackle junk-heap piles of unused baked burnt mud bricks, Gilgamesh the boy king, not more than 17, conferred with his Praetorian guards, sweating in the heat and the dirt and the flies. Who will go to Akka? Who is brave enough to go out there and confound him? They were all quiet. They all looked at Gilgamesh. None of them said anything until one of them, Birhatura by name, wasn't quiet and said that he would go. So they sent him out through the main gate, the avenue paralleled with symmetrically arranged spindle sticks of dirt-colored palms with wan fronds, and he wasn't far when Akka's soldiers seized him and escorted him through the ranks back to Akka's war chariot. The Ensi of Kish regarded him from his chariot, long black beard and muddy eyes glowering from beneath his copper helmet, and the 4 onagers snuffling at him as the flies crawled over them in the heat, and a light spidery breeze delicately touched the palm leaves that shuddered in the distance beyond him. You will tell me who he is, no? When he appears yonder there, upon the wall, yes? You need only do that for me, and then you can go, or is there some message I need to hear? A man appeared upon the wall, a distant stick figure that could have been made by the gods out of mud. Is that him? Is that your king, there upon the wall? Do you see who I mean? Flies, heat, palms, somewhere a creaking shadow of military rustlings. It was a vertigerous world of shipwrecked cities only half salvaged from the marshes and the river floods that perpetually threatened to take it all back. If that were my king, Birhatura said, then you would be seized by Namtar and turned upside down, and the plague demon would destroy every bone in your body, and the exoskeletal rack and ruin of your troops would be laid waste. Swampy, mud-soaked, green, yellow, vertigerous. They beat him with staves, and his copper helmet fell off, and his khaki leather cloak with the bronze discs sewn onto it became slick with his blood. But then another man came and stood on the part of the wall that was finished, and Birhatura said, That is my king, sire. That is Gilgamesh. And through the 7 gates of the city there poured out an efflux of soldiers, chariots, rumbling, drawn by onagers, men yelling, shouting, charging, and the Uruk war machine collided with Akka on the field, spears plunging through men's heads and throats, bronze sickle swords hacking off limbs, pale green limestone maces collapsing skulls, wooden shields shattering beneath impacts of force, leather cloaks torn by copper-bladed socket axes. The marshy green, swampy yellow, tan, and dun-colored fields before the city lay strewn with the dead and dying by day's end, as the sun, which had grown to gigantic proportions, burnt the edges of earth a blistering orange ball of burning incandescent hydrogen. They captured Akka and brought him over the ramparts and the earthworks, past the cube houses, with lime plaster floors and gypsum walls, their occupants vacant now. And they brought him into the palace, which was cool with torch shadows crawling along the walls and squirming in the corners. And Gilgamesh the boy king was eating a handful of dates from a copper bowl as Akka was brought to him. Did I not tell you, the boy said, and he looked pointedly at his aged, bearded, gray old advisors who had managed to blend into the walls. Gilgamesh was pouring himself some dark beer from a gold ewer into a silver tumbler. Did I not say this would be the will of Namtar upon this day? And he ate another date and drank from the tumbler in his other hand. Tell me, Akka, he said, what have you to say for yourself? But Akka, hands bound with leather cords before him, said nothing. I thought as much. Chunks of waning sunlight were coming through the grated slats of the windows, and they cast mottled spots upon the floor. Tell me, Akka, said the boy, do you wish to die today, or do you wish to be set free? Akka swallowed visibly and muttered, It is as you wish, sire. Said the boy. But then that's the question, isn't it? What is it that I, the son of Lugalbanda, wish to do to Akka, the son of Enmerkar, the man who thrice humiliated my father on the battlefield? If you let me go, said Akka, but then speech failed him. Yes, I'm listening. If I let you go, then what? Perhaps it would be that you would return to your father in defeat, and you would tell him that Kish is no more, that the days of its overlordship of the land have ended, that its last king, Etana, was a madman who attempted to fly into the lapis blue like a bird and plunge to his death. Perhaps it would be that you would say to him, Akka's father, together with his god Zababa, that it is Gilgamesh now. He is the king of Kish. We must cede to him and to Uruk. Perhaps it would play out that way, Akka. It would be as you wish it, Lord. Well, good, then. That's what I wish. Now get him out of here. And the men took Akka away back to his city, and the days of Kish were over. But Gilgamesh, now alone in the palace with his advisors, looked at them and sat with some gravitas upon his backless X-wing chair of cedarwood, perched upon its alabaster dais, a smirk upon his clean-shaven face. And had I listened to all of you, he said, where would we be today? Drawing water from the wells to carry the buckets to Kish? No one said anything, but someone cleared his throat, and one man coughed. Excellent, said Gilgamesh. Inanna has favored us upon the field today, and the fortunes of this city are about to change, I think, for the better. Be certain that many, many offerings are taken to the Inanna she has favored us, and so we will favor her. Now, said Gilgamesh, off with you, go get drunk. And that is how Gilgamesh the boy king became Gilgamesh, the Lugal of Uruk, in the days of the building of its walls. Okay, we'll stop there. Next begins the story proper, the first tablet, and I go through all 12 tablets in similar fashion. And so if you want the PDF for this, it's available at my Gmail. For $20, I'll send you the PDF, johndavidebert@gmail.com. Otherwise, it is available on Amazon. You can buy the print copy if you prefer that. It's on Amazon. All right, that's it.